Colleagues, welcome to this latest in the series of CGE webinars. The subject this evening is how to meet the economic challenge of climate change, and in particular the role of environmental, social and governance and the city. And we've got two very distinguished guests with us. Before I introduce them, and invite them each to speak for up to 10 minutes before opening this up to questions. Just a few housekeeping points. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the CGE website. Second, any of you who want to ask a question, please could you use the Q&A facility, and you will then be called upon by Secretary Simon Saunders to ask your question live. And then if any chance of communications break down, then I will take the liberty of trying to ask your question, having read it off the Q&A. And I aim to bring this session to an end sharp at 7:30. Our two guests are, first of all, Lord Deben, who many of you will know as John Gummer. John Deben is the current chair of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, and in that role he is independent of party politics, but of course CGE members will know that he served as the Member of Parliament first of all for Lewisham West and later for Suffolk Coastal, as a long-serving minister under both Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and in particular set a record yet to be exceeded as the longest serving Secretary of State for the Environment in the history of United Kingdom governments, at least so far. Roger Gifford is a senior banker by profession. He's worked for the Swedish bank SEB for several decades and has worked in and around the debt and equity capital markets in the UK and Japan. But relevant to this session, he led the UK government's Green Finance Taskforce in 2018 and currently chairs the UK Green Finance Institute. He was chairman of the Association of Foreign Banks from 2007 to 2011 and was Lord Mayor of London in 2012 to 13. I'm going to ask John first and then Roger to speak for up to 10 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we will go to questions. So John, over to you first, please.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. I suppose I ought to start by something that doesn't come from the Climate Change Committee, that comes from our own practice in Sancroft of helping people with their sustainability, because until relatively recently, it was quite a difficulty in getting city companies, getting investors, getting groups from the finance world to take sustainability seriously. You had to bang on their doors, you had to work hard with them, you had to explain it to people who were pretty antagonistic to it all. What has remarkably happened over the last year, and certainly over the last 6 or 9 months, is that they come and bang on your door. It's changed entirely, and it's changed because people have seen for the first time, it seems to me, universally, that sustainability is not a sort of add-on extra. It's not something that you can do if you want to look good. It's actually something you need to do if you're to protect the business which you have or the business in which you are investing. And the reason for that is that the kind of questions that sustainability asks are questions that you now have to ask if you're going to have a successful business. I always remember being told by the chairman of Coca-Cola once, we worked with them, do work with them for a very long time. He said to me, John, I must tell you that for me, the word sustainability starts with Coca-Cola being here in 125 years, as we have been for 125 years. In other words, sustainability is actually about the continuity and the success of a business. Whereas previously, the word sustainability and talking about sustainability was seen as something as a nice bit of polish, but not central to one's business. So it seems to me that the very first thing we have to say is that ESG, I'm not sure that I'm very keen on it any more than any of the other words, because they're all curiously, well, ESG is divisive. It suggests that environment, social issues and governance are separate things, when in fact they're all part of the same issue and the same way of looking at things. But ESG has become clearly incredibly important. And I want to suggest that there are three reasons for that. First of all, people recognize that if you're looking at a company to buy it, then the way the management looks at the future and the degree to which they have understood the way the world is moving is hugely important, both in terms of what you're prepared to pay for that management and also to what you have to look for in the company you're buying. So it's a question of where people are looking, how far-sighted they are. Secondly, it's actually not just a question of long distance. Many of these things are now clearly things that one has to do now if we are to be here literally in 5 years' time. That these are changes which we have to make if our businesses are to be successful. And the third thing that I think has made this huge difference is a recognition that there aren't many certain things in the world, but one of the certain things in the world is the direction in which the world is moving as far as sustainability is concerned. Primarily, of course, that means on the battle against climate change. Now, of course, we're not doing enough. Of course, a lot of things that people promise to do, they're not going to deliver. Of course, it's true that we're going to have to do more and more, but it's still true that we know precisely what direction we're moving in. Governments are not going to go back on the Paris Agreement. They don't think in the way that they used to think, and that is a fundamental fact of life. So if you put those three things together, it seems to me that it isn't surprising that the city has become much more interested in these issues, indeed to the degree in which it insists upon having proper ESG in an increasing number of companies. We then have to recognize that this is much wider than the city, and the first breadth of that is indeed investors themselves. One of the things we have to say very often to companies who are investing other people's money is that unless you have an ESG policy yourself, then your investors will demand one. And the trouble with that is that they'll demand different ones, that they'll all have their own private sets that they're rather keen on. And you therefore have to create an agenda which is attractive to them and upon which they can rely. Particularly, you have to have an agenda which has the same degree of, if you like, expertise that they expect to see from you in the way in which you invest their money. So there's a real reason why that wider group, the investor, is becoming more and more important in this area. The second reason is that, of course, government is beginning to recognize that it has to take an active part in this. Now, I've always been the kind of conservative that believes in regulation. I just don't believe in bad regulation. I always think those Tories who talk antagonistically about regulation really want to be reminded that we have to drive on the left-hand side of the road. And that if you don't have a regulation as to how people drive on the roads, you kill a lot of people. And once you start there, you begin to recognize that regulation is an essential part of any civilized society. And COVID-19 has brought that back home to people in a way which perhaps they haven't recognized before. And interestingly, this government, which in many ways has a view which is rather of the non-regulatory type, has recognized just how important regulation is if you're going to achieve the fundamental things that you need to achieve in order to defeat the pandemic. So regulation is an increasing reality of life, and international regulation, of course, is also going to be really seriously important. It was, of course, madness to leave the European Union. There can be no more damaging thing that anyone can have done for a very long time. And we will find it more and more so. But the thing that we'll also find is that the idea of taking back control is a pretty unsuccessful comment. Because if the European Union, whether we have a deal or not, if the European Union has regulations on these issues, then frankly, if we don't have them, then we won't attract the investment that we will need. And we're going to have them without having any control over the decisions about what those regulations should be. And that's going to be true internationally too, because we will be looking for international agreement much wider than the European Union if we're going to get the kind of society which is going successfully to fight climate change. And the third extension of where all this is going is the population, people as a whole. It seems to me very interesting just how much since the whole issue of COVID has dominated the newspapers, how much the issues of sustainability have become crucial to the way that people think about their lives and their futures. I didn't think it was going to be like that. I have to say that I am really surprised at how important it is. I thought, if I look then across again at my business, I thought we were going to have real difficulty in drawing people back to the issues of sustainability, because I thought they were going to be so dominated by how you deal with COVID that would not be on their agenda. Totally different. It's right up on their agenda. What COVID has done is to make people recognize that you can't push these things into the back. You can't hope that something will turn up. You've actually got to face them. And that's true not just of businessmen, but of so many people throughout the country and indeed the world. And that's made a big change. And I want to end on this. When I started dealing with climate change, it was back in the days when I was Minister of State in Agriculture in Mrs. Thatcher's government. I always remember having to ask her to get some support for improving the standards of our sea defences, and saying to her that unfortunately the Treasury didn't seem to be prepared to do this. But climate change was happening and we ought to do it. And she said, memorably on the phone, she said, John, there are two people in this government who believe in climate change, you and global warming, you and me. We are therefore a majority, so I suggest you go ahead. The reality was that we did then start on a plan for sea defences, which, although not entirely satisfactory, puts us ahead of others. And that was very remarkable. The reason I tell that story is that in those days, in the 1980s, you always had to start a discussion about climate change by arguing the case for it happening. But you know, it doesn't happen like that any longer. One doesn't have to start there at all. And even those people who are stupid enough still to be publicly deniers have become lukewarmers. And the reason they become lukewarmers is you can't deny it any longer. You do actually have to accept those facts. And if you look at the latest Lombard book, for example, you find that it's a desperate attempt to justify a different position from that which is the majority, indeed the overwhelming position. So what seems to me to be finally the crucial thing for business is that you have to live in the real world. I've run businesses ever since I was about 22, and I just have to say, the first rule is, do accept facts, do accept the world you live in, do realize you only make money if you recognize what is happening round about you. And that's really why ESG and the city have become partners, if that's the right word. It's because any sensible businessman knows that climate change is happening, that the world is going to have to fight it, and that your business needs to be absolutely aware of that, preparing itself for the effects on itself and its supply chain, And otherwise, it won't be in business in 5 years' time.
John, thank you very much indeed. Roger Gifford.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for preparing the ground for me. I'm not going to disagree with anything you've said, but I might embellish on it a little. The FT quote you sent round said, what is needed is a right-wing case for climate action. And I hope to present you a case, whether it's right-wing or not, is for you to judge, but it's deeply commercial and it's deeply political. And there are, as is customary, also with John, 3 good reasons to support it. But the first is a technical story, because if you like, the climate crisis is a technical failure. Many countries, especially in Asia, not just China, have grown rapidly post-war, and especially in the last 50 to 60 years, and clean energy has failed to keep up with their ambitions. Nuclear power has failed to deliver, renewables have only recently come on the scene, so fossil fuel energy sources have doubled since 1980. They have been the only viable source of energy for national aspirations around the globe. It's been fossil until very recently, and let's face it, we've all benefited from that, economically as well. We shouldn't beat around the bush. Nuclear is another discussion altogether, which makes the technology of renewables and their potential really interesting, already showing growth patterns identical to those seen in earlier product revolutions. New energy technologies are now seen to be superior to the incumbents. And even in the absence of a climate crisis, you could argue that markets would be driving the rapid expansion of these technologies and pushing down prices at the same time. Actually, it's already happening. Solar, wind, battery, certainly coming. Hydrogen, who knows, against fossil and carbon intensive technologies. By the way, if anyone doubts this is possible, please come to Sweden. I work for a Swedish bank, which has over the past 30 years totally changed its domestic energy profile from individual gas boilers to district and community heating and ground source heating. We need to do the same here with our 50 million gas boilers, which is something the Green Finance Institute is looking at very closely alongside BEIS and HMT. And consider for a moment the IT revolution, which all of us have seen pretty much during our own lifetimes. It started about 60 years ago, but only really got going in the 90s. Typically, product revolutions need a 30-year incubation period, followed by a 30-year period of disruption, followed by another 30 years of stabilization. The first 30 years of incubation see the technology developed a little bit below the radar until cost or efficiency parity is reached. Revolutions actually often seem to start with a killer application, inspiring their followers and creative engineers. Think of the Carnegie Steelworks of 1875, or the Ford Model T in 1914, or the IBM personal computer of 1981, and indeed the Tesla Model S of 2012. This incubation period, the 30-year incubation period, is followed by a period of exploding volumes, unit price declines, and soaring profits for the new monopolies. That Apple is now worth more than the whole of the FTSE 100 is pretty mind-blowing. Yeah. There's then often a period of stabilization which sees greatly increased regulation to make sure that the gains are passed on to consumers and the traditional excesses of capitalist innovation are tempered and taxed. I suggest we are just entering that third period with the IT markets now. With the renewable energy, we're approaching the second phase of disruption with the usual business and political challenges that encompasses. Interestingly, BP and Shell understand this and are, like the Danish oil and natural gas company, turning themselves over time into renewable, low-carbon energy companies. By the way, the increase in market capitalization, market value of the Danish company since it switched course and renamed itself Ørsted is absolutely fantastic. I wish I'd been a shareholder. Another discussion. But the key is this. For investor, buying into better technologies on a falling cost curve and leading the way, embedding those factors into your business model has always been a driver of long-term competitive advantage. And I think it's exactly that John was referring to a moment ago. Buying into better technologies, falling cost curve, leading the way, embedding those into your company to make them more secure, more sustainable going forwards. It was the case with IT, it was the case with chips and processors, with mass production technologies, the first wave of electrification, even cars and steam engines all the way back. It's a similar story, similar timeline. Don't we all wish we'd bought shares in Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft in their really early days, or that our grandfathers had bought into Henry Ford motor cars and tractors 100 years ago, when many people said they would never replace the horse. It simply wouldn't be economical. They argued that swathes of existing industry, the farriers, the leather sellers, the carriage makers, and the wheelwrights, would all be put out of business. It would be a terrible thing to see the motor car develop. Yes. Well, that was it. The second reason is about votes. Because whilst the growth of renewable energy is impressive, all the scientific evidence suggests it's not fast enough. This has captured the popular zeitgeist exactly as become the popular zeitgeist, exactly as John was saying, and we need to move faster to halt a potential climate crisis before it is too late. Now, the UK has a pretty advanced policy framework to support this, to support the political will that's needed. We have the 2008 Climate Change Act. We have a net zero target by 2050. We can be proud of both of these. As a result, there's a powerful, though intangible incentive for societies to speed up the transition process. And I believe politicians know this. They don't always know how to tackle the problem, but they know it's there and that they have to do something. Greta Thunberg is not a one-off. She is part of a continuum of people increasingly motivated to tackle this sustainability issue. The youth of today know it. If we want their votes, we have to align our policies accordingly. Because the environmental movement has moved, and again, John effectively said this, is moved from the environmentalists to business and commerce and finance. There isn't time now to go into the ESG revolution happening in investment management, but it's well documented and it's there in the FT pretty well every day, who now even have their own section called Moral Money to guide us along. At its core, this movement is deeply, deeply small c conservative. It's about getting back to how things were before plastic packaging was invented, before we produced annually tons of rubbish per person, not so long ago. I'm sure you all remember brown paper bags for our groceries, and what a good bang they made when you blew them up. Already our local grocery is getting back to brown paper bags, and I think it's a fantastic sign. Times when we grew local produce and ate fruit in season, times when we concentrated on preserving and maintaining rather than consuming and disposing. Times, dare I say it, when many of us wore jumpers inside to keep warm and didn't assume a constant 23 degrees inside our homes, our cars, and our offices. Well, I'm half joking, but I'm also half serious. And of course, we have today the benefit of technology to enjoy much more than we did then, and many more products to diversify our diets and our tastes. And actually, the carbon used in the delivery to your table of a South African strawberry in January can be less than that of a Dutch one due to the free sun and energy in South Africa versus the carbon used in the flight. So the picture is, as always, a little bit complex. That leads me neatly into a mention of the Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity Loss, led by Professor Partha Dasgupta of Cambridge University, sponsored by the Treasury, due to report later this year. This is a great piece of work. Look out for it, read it, and it's one I think we will really be proud of. Lastly, thirdly, the case for climate action must recognise international competition and the desire we all have for the UK to be at the front of progress, at the front of this technical revolution. No one understands this better than China. Their securing of the markets in rare metals, their involvement in lithium mining, in the production of electric engines and batteries is just one sign of this. They dominate the market in solar panels, whether it's got a Japanese or a Chinese or a German label on the product or not. They've been the world's largest manufacturers of solar panels since 2008, and since 2011 have produced the majority of global photovoltaics on an annualized basis. It's estimated that by the end of 2017, China had enough manufacturing capacity to produce over 50 gigawatts of PV modules a year, more than twice the amount that was being produced by the world in 2010. And they're a leader, by the way, in wind power too, of course. And they're not alone. There are many other countries investing, perhaps not quite to the same scale. The UK is also well represented here in research and development, though we can do more, much more. We also see significant investment in hydrogen energy, development in Japan and Germany and elsewhere, with many other countries investing heavily. From a politician's point of view, it's a great area to support British business in. Similarly, wind power and thermal ground source in the Nordics and so on. So there are my three cases: technology, votes, and international competition. That's the case for the prosecution, Malad.
Well done. Very good.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Roger. Now, questions. And I've got a number that have been submitted already, and I want to run through those. Simon, I'm going to go first to Sir Robert Atkins, and then, Simon, if before our speakers answer, if you could also call Peter Dawson, because Peter's question is very much linked to Sir Robert, and I think probably it'd be sensible to group them together. So, Sir Robert Atkins, please, whom John in particular may recall meeting previously.
Yes. Well, good evening, gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. Well, it's good to be back, at least in the presence of my former boss, because for a time I served as a minister under John, looking after the countryside and rural affairs. But now I've moved on and I've become an even more important person, and I'm a local councillor again, and have been tasked with being chairman of the climate change policy group within our borough. And therefore we're trying to do what we possibly can to focus on the subject in hand. I agree with everything that John and Roger have said in terms of the background, but I wondered, given the climate that faces local authorities at the moment financially, whether either of them or both of them have got some bright ideas that we could get local councils to do, not just planting trees and changing the planning procedures, but some more fundamental things. The reason I mention that is because the Local Government Intelligence Unit today is talking about an outfit called Abundance, which is supposed to be investing in green energy, green sustainable industries or companies within local authority areas, and encouraging local authorities to get involved. So any thoughts, ideas or suggestions would be most gratefully received.
Thank you, Robert. And Peter Dawson, please.
Oh, thank you very much, David. I'm a councillor like Robert in Wandsworth, and again, it's interesting. It was the article on abundance that I saw yesterday or the day before that I was going to frame my question around, because local government is one of the key delivery vehicles for much of environmental and sustainability. So what are our speaker thoughts about using community and municipal investments to raise funds from residents for local schemes to promote our environmental and sustainability strategy? The examples given apparently where this has already started are West Berkshire and Warrington.
Thank you. Good. John, first of all, please.
Well, first of all, I'm very pleased to talk to Robert again. I'm pleased that he's taking this very serious role. I think that this is very interesting around the country to see the part played right across the political spectrum by people who are serious about politics and who do understand how important this is centrally. I do think the government needs, first of all, to be pressed by Conservative councillors as well as others to recognise that local government is one of the prime, if not the prime, ways of delivering what we have to deliver for climate change. And I'm afraid it's not a government that has shown itself to be wildly understanding of the realities of climate change and local authorities. And we need local authorities to be working, and in many cases it's the local authorities that are leading the way. So first of all, use your links and your ways of getting at government to make sure that local authorities are part of it. Secondly, I do think we've got to learn again about participation and the public. Local authorities themselves, if they're going to ask government to be much more accepting and encouraging and enabling, have themselves got to be much better at enabling local action, making people able to contribute. And I've never understood really why local authorities are so poor at doing this when they are the people who know the places street by street and church by church and organisation by organisation. So if local authorities think of themselves in terms of enablers, then it seems to me that whatever Abundance is doing and other people are doing, they are in a position to play their part. Thirdly, I'm not totally a believer that local authorities are at their best when it comes to investment. I mean, I only look at the number of local authorities who have burnt their fingers badly on investing in retail things in order to get relief from their rates on by borrowing money from the loans board, and then finding that they've bought things which are increasingly unacceptable. I don't think local authorities are particularly good at investment, but what I do think they're good at is getting other people able to invest, to create the circumstances in which a mixture of investment, business, enabling by local authority and encouragement of public support creates the circumstances in which those investment takes place. And as you go around the country, you find all sorts of communities that have been able to invest in community renewable energy, for example, doing all kinds of things, but it's the local authority that has made it possible, been the convener, gathered people together and given them credibility and, in a sense, legitimacy. And I do think that working in that way, local authorities will be able to carry through what is their huge responsibility, which is making the changes on a local level which climate change demands.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, absolutely. We are unusual in the UK that we don't permit our local authorities to borrow individually or invest individually in the same way as many other countries. So much of the drive towards community heating in particular has happened in other countries through the municipality, the city of Stockholm or the city of Gothenburg, or indeed the provinces of Victoria, or it's a similar story in Canada. I think Abundance are doing a fantastic job, and I really encourage engagement with them and talk to them about the projects they've already landed around local community heating, local changes to water for purification, funded locally by people who can buy these bonds for their pension funds, often with a good return. Should be a pretty safe risk as a local authority. So I'm very positive to the work they are doing. I would only say that look at the projects they're suggesting, and if they should be green, they should be sustainable, because that's exactly the path that most local authorities are being encouraged to go down. And absolutely engage with them and with the banks or whoever you can to see what's available out there. Abundance use a community funding model. I wish there was a central funding model as well, which would help all local authorities to invest directly into their district, their community heating, and in their local pollution controls, their local water controls. We have a model which, to me, as a banker, is way over-centralized, I'm afraid. Treasury would hate to hear that, but I feel it's over-centralized. I'd love to see more power devolved down to the local authorities.
Thank you. Colin Bramall.
I think my question is probably aimed at Sir Roger. And I speak actually as the master of a livery company which produces the most sustainable product, which is fans. I'd be very curious to hear from you, because I spent most of my career in a turnaround situation in medium-sized to large businesses, where we were turning around, and so constantly we were struggling with the banks and with covenants on the banks, and finding that actually the sustainability agenda was really the last thing which would be on your mind, because you were solely interested in solvency, and certainly the attitude of the banks was not particularly encouraging towards looking at those sorts of issues. And I wonder whether you have done any work in considering the legal framework and the responsibilities on the directors requiring solvency as opposed to sustainability.
If I take that one, David?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think bankers were on the whole short-term in their thinking and slow to this table, if I may say so. But I think you'd find the attitude very different now. But banks, and I would say it's led by the Dutch, the French, and certainly the Nordics, we are absolutely hot on the whole sustainability angle of the companies that we're lending to, in order to be sure that they have got the right solutions in place. This is about avoiding stranded assets. It's about avoiding technologies that are going to cost them a lot of money in the future. If we introduce a €75 carbon tax around the whole of Europe, and therefore by extension maybe the UK, what would happen to the energy costs of many of those companies, Rolls-Royce onwards, if they haven't got the right parameters in place? That's the sort of question I would say that banks are asking themselves absolutely more now than they have done ever before, and certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a bit of an explosion of interest. Apart from anything else, I might mention the Bank of England is going to be doing stress tests on the climate resilience of banks early next year. That means that every bank has to ask every corporate where they are and what they're doing, and it has to incorporate that kind of thinking into their credit, their solvency thinking. So I think it's a very different situation, Colin, Master, from where you were possibly just a few years ago. As for work on the legal framework, there's a lot of work around, if you like, around the regulation, around the guidelines on TCFD, the Taskforce Financial Disclosure guidelines. There's a lot of work as to how much that can be involved in the solvency measurement that banks have, and whether the Bank of England will permit banks to up and down the credit that they're making available to companies according to those guidelines. There's a lot of discussion around that, but I think in general you would find the attitude of banks 100% different from where it was just a few years ago. Many of them are issuing green bonds, many of them have green frameworks in their business. They know the shareholders, they like it, they know their employees like it, and I think they know that that's the way the wind is blowing.
Thank you. John, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I very much agree with that. Banks are changing, but again, rather like anything else, you just have to look at it. Just as you can talk about Shell and BP and realise they're doing something wholly different from ExxonMobil. So you can look at the banks and see that some are doing very much better than others. And we really do need to bring pressure upon those that really are not meeting the standards which are now being led.
Thank you. Right, next question, and again, Simon, I'm going to take group two together here, because I think they are related. John Preston first, and then after John, Rupert Borden, and then I'll come to our guests.
You gave us for this meeting, which is the low percentages, particularly of the Conservative Party, in terms of being aware of this important subject. To what extent am I entitled to blame, particularly the House of Commons? I think John can tell us a bit more about the House of Lords, but I would also point criticism at the way the BBC seems to be spreading its jam. Could I hear that I'm wrong from our two speakers, that I've misjudged the BBC, the House of Lords and the House of Commons in communicating this important subject to us?
Thank you. And Rupert.
Yes, thank you. A general question is just how we go about re-establishing a pro-European voice at the centre of the Conservative Party, and that's within government particularly. I mean, it's as much a collaborative ethos and an ethos that works with the grain of reality.
Thank you. I think, John, probably come to you first on these.
Well, I have to be careful about my comments being an independent as far as these matters are concerned. But I think if I take the second question first, I think we have to recognise that the nonsenses that at the moment dominate our party, because I sit as a Conservative, dominate our party, have got to be shaken out first of all, because they've really got to get it out of their system. And we've gone through periods like this before, and there will be an understanding that it just won't be re-elected if it doesn't get itself much more in the world we live in, rather than the world that some people, I think wrongly, would like to live in. So I think that's going to be the affliction of time. I don't think we're going to be able to set up some system that's going to be going to make that change very, very rapidly. And I don't know, David, you've more experience in this than I, but I suspect that you would take the same view about the timing at the moment. It is the realities of life that bring Conservatives back to the realisation that if you want to stay in power or get into power, you've actually got to recognise the facts and the nature of the world in which you live, rather than promoting the theories of a small group of extremists. So that, I think, is all I'd say about that, because I think that's just a general historic statement with no reference, of course, to anybody living at this moment. I then move on to the question that was first asked. I mean, the reality of the world in which we live has come home to people, and there is a real consensus across party to make the changes we need to make. The trouble with consensus is that it can lead to a kind of complacency. And I do think that there is among members of parliament generally a kind of willingness to say, well, the government got this under control and we'll be supporting it. And government's clearly talking the right language. And there is no doubt that the Prime Minister, with whom I have been known to disagree, the Prime Minister has actually very clearly understood this. His latest letter to the Climate Change Committee was, frankly, in some ways, a surprise in the degree of its commitment. And I really do think that he's understood this. And I think the government as a whole has understood it. But that means that it's got to act as a whole, and it's got to recognise that it's not just a matter for BEIS and for the Foreign Office and for DEFRA, it's actually for the Department of Education and the Department of Health and the DCMS and the rest. But as far as members of parliament are concerned, I really do object to, frankly, criticism of the BBC. I actually am fed up with this campaign which is going on and which Conservatives have been lending their voices to, attacking the BBC in various different ways. Actually, I do think the BBC tries to do what is an extremely difficult thing, which is to actually represent and give a voice to the whole range of opinions. And we want, if we want to have more voices, as I imagine the questioner wants, more voices from the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, then we've got to have louder voices from those individuals. One of the problems is that quite a lot of them have been taken into government, people who have really been very good on climate change and are acting very well as ministers, are therefore not backbenchers able to make the kind of comments they ought to. And some of the new members really need to get up and make a great deal more noise. In the House of Lords, well, it's there are the usual suspects, of course, who don't take these views, and we have to handle them and deal with them. They've always been like that. Peter Lilly, for example, voted against the original Climate Change Act and has always taken these views, but I don't think has very much support in the generality of Conservatives in the House of Lords. But again, I think we've got to speak out more effectively and we've got to do it better in the House of Lords. The reality is there has to be a greater sense of urgency, a sharpness about this, which cuts through the inevitable complacency which a cross-party consensus has, and really makes the point that if we are going to succeed as a nation, if we're going to deal with the post-COVID crisis, we have to do these things more effectively, quicker, and with much more concentration and continuity, so that people know where they are and the government doesn't look as if it's swinging from one thing to another, but really gives business an absolute understanding that they will stick by their word. It's better not to be perfect, but to be continuous. It's better to go on doing things upon which people can rely than trying to tinker with them. The green, the green history of good people constantly tinkering with what the government offers should teach us that it's better to get it almost right than to try to get it perfect.
Roger, I mean, do you want to come in?
And I'd love to, because although I'm not a politician, I don't know either house at all well. I wasn't surprised by that figure, to be honest, because I think on the whole, politicians probably reflect their voters, and on the whole, the voters have been taking time to understand what this technical revolution means. Typically, again, going back to IT, all the people who started that were represented as geeks, as weirdos who had long hair and grew up in garages. These are the modern masters of the universe today. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the time that they were growing, there were a lot of Luddites out there saying, this won't happen, this won't work, I don't want to get rid of my fax machine, I mean, and all the rest of it. So I wasn't that surprised, but I do think we will see a very different picture in the few years going forwards. I'm afraid I don't have a view on the BBC. On the whole, I think they too reflect what they think viewers want to hear. But actually, there's been a lot on the health of society, on diabetes, on asthma, and all the rest as we go through COVID. And from my perspective in the investment world, in the banking world, the COVID has exposed a number of the frailties of our system, which we can go into from a financial perspective if you like, but it's particularly made people acutely conscious about the world we live in. And how clean is it? How good is it? How is the air? How are the plastics I consume? And this is absolutely driving, I think, financial behaviour going forward. And I think that both the BBC hasn't reflected that badly, but I think politicians will increasingly come to understand that and reflect it, particularly as their constituents say that they have an interest in it too. But I wasn't particularly surprised by the figure. What I have been very impressed by the last 4 years is the quality of the civil service, the servants that I've dealt with. And the people in Bays and Gifford and the Department of Transport, extremely enthusiastic about finding new ways of energy production, new ways to fuel ships, new ways to get rid of all the gas boilers around the country, or retrofit buildings, whatever it is. And I've had nothing but positive engagement, and it's been, I won't say a surprise, it's been an absolute delight working with people like Claire Perry, people like Nick Hurd, people like many people at senior and at the working level who are all very keen to see some kind of change happening. So I've been excited about it. Just a word on the EU. We have led a lot of the green finance work for the EU. We in the UK had many people on the EU taxonomy working party. Let's not forget that. So we are a standard setter in many ways. In fact, I would say the gold standards in green finance going forwards can be British, they can be UK inspired. And we, in that respect, I think we have a great opportunity for harmony and discourse with the EU. And when people refer to the EU taxonomy, just remember a lot of it was British created.
Thank you. Nicholas McLean.
Thank you. The government's energy white paper is endlessly delayed, and a great deal hinges on it for setting the right framework. Can the speakers shed some light on the disagreements behind the scenes which may have caused this delay? Or is it purely a distraction of other issues?
Thank you. Do either of you, can either of you shed light on this, John?
Well, I was hoping Roger was going to give some.
I can chip in briefly, simply to say that energy is complex, and what the right energy is with the right profile is extremely. You make investments now which last for 30 years, and yet you don't know actually whether hydrogen is about to come along and solve every problem that we have, or we're going to find a new way of doing safe nuclear or whatever it is. So I think it's a very complex. I believe that the solution to a lot of our energy issues are local. And it's why I come back to the very first question, which came from Colin and others about, was it Colin? No, sorry, it wasn't Colin, it was from Robert Atkins, about the power of local authorities to make change. And if we are worried about the Climate Change Act 2008 and our target of 2050, I believe it's going to be delivered as much locally as it is by major, we got rid of coal. It could take decades to get rid of gas as a national fuel source, simply because of the complexity of knowing what else to replace it with. We're building windmills, wind farms like crazy. There's almost probably a limit to the number we can eventually put in. But it's a complex issue.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with it is we've always found it difficult to have an energy white paper. I mean, do you remember the Labour government under, there was no energy white paper. And when it finally came out, they removed all the dates in it except 2050. And I'm afraid I rather rudely at the time said that the reason it was 2050 was that no member of the cabinet would be alive then, so they'd nobody be able to say they hadn't achieved what they said they'd achieved. And this is one of the problems, is that people don't want to put their name to something which says we've got to do something by 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 7 years' time. Now, that's the first problem. Second problem is that better not minister is a phrase which is heard in the energy area more than anywhere else. Better not put your eggs in that basket. Don't back particular technologies. And the trouble is, we do have to back some technologies. We do have to have, for example, carbon capture, storage and usage. We do actually have to develop hydrogen. We do actually have to make real decisions about getting people to move their heating from gas, because if we don't do that, we can't achieve the commitment that we've made statutorily to deliver net zero by 2050. And we certainly aren't going to meet the 4th and 5th carbon budget, which again is the law. And I don't want to be the witness for the prosecution of the government for failing to do that. So I'm very keen on the government getting this right. So it really has to recognise that. The other thing is, it's not just the government and local authorities, it's all of us individually. I say that because I've been struggling over the last 3 or 4 weeks to organise the changeover of my own domestic heating so that I go over to an air source heat pump and try to be as environmentally friendly as I can. And that leads me to say something to the government, which is that before any white paper, the real issue you have to grapple with is, how do you make it easy for people to do good and difficult to do bad? You have really got to understand that this is all very complicated for people, and they don't trust the people who advise them, quite rightly, because there are a lot of cowboys in the world. And therefore, one of the things the government doesn't seem to get right, and it should be doing it through local authorities, I ought to be able to ask my local authority, what is the deal that they have put together, which they are overseeing in terms of the quality? What is the deal that I can do in order to provide the environmentally friendly answer that I want? And who are the people whom the local authority has seen are capable of doing that delivery? Because there are a lot of people who are prepared to spend the money on it and set the example. But the thing that is worrying is that it's quite difficult to get these things put together.
I can only support that. Might also add that on energy policy, as Nick will know very well, Japan, Germany, United States are all having real issues around sorting their Germany, real issues around their energy policy. So we're not alone in this. And I think it is about technology rather than politics on the whole.
Thank you. We've got a short time left. I'll try and get through as many of the outstanding questions as I can, and I'll ask the speakers, questioners and speakers both, to be succinct, please, in what they say. Nacho Moraes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy because it's my first week as member of the CGE. So I wanted to ask you just very briefly, from the standpoint of investment into ESG, that is what touches me professionally. First, I find that there is a lot of greenwashing, especially when people talk about the integration methodology of ESG, that at the end of the day they say, yes, we take factors into account, but many times there is not explicit way that they do. And another point is that is sometimes a dirty word around the ESG question, that is adaptation. The thing is that, okay, there are things that even if we are 40 years in confinement, there will still be happening, and we should also adapt. I think that obviously one thing is that, okay, don't build or buy a hotel in the coast of certain areas of the world. Another is, oh, let's make a trade route through the Arctic because it's melting. So what do you think of these two things, the greenwashing and the adaptation? Thank you.
Okay, Roger?
On greenwashing, I think there is a potential for it. I've actually seen rather little of it. But there's a tendency for all companies to try and find out exactly how far they can go in terms of their carbon production and their internal policies in order to qualify as an ESG investor. I think John said earlier he didn't particularly like ESG. I'm not particularly keen on it either. I'd rather see E separated from S&G, and S&G, but S&G are hygiene factors. They should be there all the time. It's the E that we want to focus on. David, you want us to be brief, but I think it's a concern. We're aware of it, and we should absolutely be on top of the greenwashing as much as we possibly can.
Well, I think there is greenwashing, and the worst part of greenwashing are people claiming to reach net zero by some particular date, and then actually defining net zero in a way which has got nothing to do with what we have to do. And indeed, the Climate Change Committee is going to produce what we can only call as a sort of golden rule about how you measure net zero. And for example, the National Farmers Union has a programme for meeting net zero in 2040, except it isn't net zero. It's double counting in order to reach the net zero. And it really does mean that people don't believe them and don't believe people who make these claims. So I'm very keen that we should have much more careful examination of people's claims, whether they're businesses or individuals, and let's get that right. And then we will be able to believe those who are really trying to do it and not those who are actually trying to get away with some greenwashing.
Thank you. Robert Morland. Is Robert there?
Isn't normally slow in coming forward.
No.
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, yes, here now.
Thank you for that very kind comment. I would just like to ask, are you concerned about specific areas that we might actually are under threat of going backwards in terms of our legislation? I'm thinking from my own experience on the Canal and River Trust in terms of water, where there's a lot of pressure from certain organisations not to have restrictions, although we have a lot of evidence that a lot of our rivers are low, threatening fish, etc. And also in the area of trade deals that we're going through, that we might be under some pressure from countries not so good on climate change like the United States.
Thank you. John?
Well, first of all, on trade deals, it really would be totally unacceptable to sign trade deals which mean that countries that do not meet our standards would be exporting into Britain in competition. I take food as an example. The United States has very, very much more foodborne disease because their standards are nothing like as good as ours. Nobody worries about chlorination, but the reason they have to chlorinate chickens is because they bring chickens up so badly that if you didn't chlorinate them, you'd poison people. In this country, we do actually insist upon welfare terms, which means that you don't have to chlorinate. And the same is true about the use of chemicals and particularly hormones in the bringing up of beef. And the whole business of beef lots and the destruction of the environment, both in the United States and in Brazil, would mean that a trade deal which did not enable us to maintain our standards is not a trade deal worth having and is not something that Britain should allow, and the public should insist upon it. The government has promised us that it will uphold these standards, but at the same time, the Secretary of State for International Trade refuses to allow issues like climate change or the environment to be involved in these debates and discussions. And we know why, because I've done the negotiations on behalf of the European Union for a whole year. And I know what happens when you debate with the United States. There's a whole row of people out there representing the pressure groups, and they are not going to have a deal which does not allow their goods produced in unacceptable ways into the United Kingdom. And I do think the same is true in Brazil. The idea that we are going to be partners in the destruction of the rainforest because we would be importing things which are only being grown because of that destruction would be an outrage. So I'm very clear about the fact that there are some areas which we're going backwards in. The most important thing is to make sure that we do not allow our desperation to get a trade deal to destroy all these things that we've done over the last 40 years.
Roger?
I agree. If you have more questions, I agree. That's fine.
Yes,
I totally agree. Well done, John. Well said.
Okay, I'm good at the last two, if you'll forgive me very slightly over time, but I'll just pair the last two because they're both relating to sort of city and green finance. And I'll take Tim Skeet and Christopher Nash.
Yeah, good evening. Just a quick one. Evening, Roger. Glad to see you here. We're all bankers. You talk a lot about lending, ESG. I just asked the question, is it right that banks should be the instrument of public policy so that the Bank of England regulates the banks, so the banks regulate industry by adjusting the pricing of their lending? Is this the right way to go about it, which appears to be the way that it's happening at the moment?
Thank you. And Christopher Nash?
To compete with China, Asia, America, etc., capture jobs of the future for the UK, how do we help earlier stage companies in the UK to find more funding? Investors prepared to take some technology risk, particularly the commercialization of new technologies, or more resolve and ambition from government when other countries invest billions to see which technology might succeed? I've worked with multiple companies in the UK over 15 years now, and most of the funding comes from the USA. Years ago, the Low Carbon Network Fund of some 500 million, run by Ofgem and then DEC as was deliberately designed to allow the testing of new technologies in the UK without getting snagged on matched funding. If a company can find some private funding at all, they probably don't need any support from government, e.g., they go and get money from the USA.
Thank you. Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I don't think banks are instruments of public policy, and I don't think actually that's the intention of the Bank of England either. The Bank of England sees risks, and they see commercial, and we see commercial opportunity. And as I was saying earlier, this is about a technical revolution which we stand to benefit from as a society. There will be casualties of that, and that's what I think the Bank of England is much keener to see who those casualties are. I think this is an unstoppable revolution. I really do. This is not about governments telling us to be good and be better climate actors. This is about the technology driving change, exactly like IT. Nobody said everybody has to have a mobile phone, but my goodness, look at our dependency now. And I think we're going exactly the similar path, similar direction at an earlier stage with renewable energy. On the second question, we've always had an issue in this country with venture capital funding. We just don't have the same structure as the United States. We're much more similar to France and Germany. I am very pro an idea floating around at the moment about a new, what is effectively not a green investment bank, but a new national infrastructure bank, part of whose mandate would be around venture capital. I'm very pro that. And I think that in this area of clean tech, of energy tech, that would be one of the solutions we could look at. And when that comes up, I hope anybody out there who has a vote will look favourably upon it. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Well, that second part I entirely agree with. It's very curious, isn't it? We've known this about Britain for a very, very long time, and governments have talked about it, but they have never achieved an end. And therefore, I entirely agree about the infrastructure bank. I also think that we've really got to think of more imaginative ways of working, and the government has got to recognise that investment by government in circumstances where others will not invest is actually essential, and that it won't be just future generations, it'll be people at the next election will begin to ask what the government has been doing. So I think that is absolutely a crucial part of it. As far as the Bank of England and it be an instrument of public policy, can I say to you, Tim, that is precisely the opposite of what both of us were saying. We were saying that the investment industry, that finance is doing these things because it has to do them, because it recognizes that this is necessary for the future. These are choices that are being made because of risks that are being recognized. And if the Bank of England did other than this, it would actually be doing something which would be entirely wrong for the bank to be doing, because it would not be recognizing risk. It would not be recognizing where stranded assets will be. It would not be recognizing the realities of life. And we have enough people around in public life who don't recognize reality without the Bank of England going down that route. The truth is, the most important thing to tell people, politicians and businessmen, is face the facts. Face the facts and act urgently to have an answer to the challenges and the risks that those facts present.
Well said.
Thank you. And thank you to all those who have asked questions. Before I close the meeting, just to say, anybody who's not yet a CGE member but would be interested in joining the group, please go to our website, conservativegroupforeurope.org.uk, and full details will be in there. We'll be scheduling further webinars in the near future and will circulate details in due course. And can I say a very warm thank you to both Lord Deben and Sir Roger Gifford for giving up their time and for speaking with such expert knowledge and also with a directness and humour that has made this a very memorable hour and a bit. Thank you both, and we'll have to resort to virtual applause only, I'm afraid, and I look forward, colleagues, to you joining us again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.